All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to move out of Italy and we're going to talk about what's happening in the rest of Europe. So we're going to talk about the Northern Renaissance. We're going to first talk about the political context in which it emerged, and then we're going to talk about how the Northern Renaissance was similar and how it was different from the Italian Renaissance. All right, so let's talk about political context first, and I'm going to warn you this is going to get a little bit complicated, so if you have any questions, let me know. All right, so just generally speaking, in the late 1400s is when the Renaissance begins to spread to Northern Europe. So it's especially going to spread to the Low Countries, which are like Belgium and the Netherlands. It's going to spread to the German states, it's going to spread to France, and it's going to spread to England as well. And there are several reasons for this. So first of all, a lot of it has to do with trade and contact with Italy. So especially when France invades Italy in the 1490s, they're going to see what's going on in Italy, think it's pretty cool, and bring it back to Northern Europe. Second of all, technology. So the printing press, as we mentioned, that ability to cheaply and quickly create books is going to help new Renaissance ideas spread. Students from Northern Europe are going to go study at Italian universities and bring back humanist philosophy. And then the last reason is kind of this big, broad reason. We know that feudalism is declining in the rest of Europe after the Black Death. That trend is going to continue during this time. And as we know from looking at Italy, the Renaissance tends to develop in areas that don't have that super rigid feudal power structure. But there is a major difference between the political context of Italy and the political context of Northern Europe that's going to shape how the Northern Renaissance, develops and make it a little bit different from the Italian Renaissance. So Italy, as we mentioned, was very decentralized, and the big power players in Italy were the church and those non-noble, powerful merchant families, right? And we know that they were the ones funding scholarship and art in Italy. On the other hand, Northern Europe is much more centralized. So even though feudalism's on the decline, we see the rise of very powerful monarchs, and they're going to play a bigger role than the church and merchant families in funding artists and scholars. So there's 3 countries in particular where these strong monarchies, we call them new monarchies because they're unique and different, and we'll talk about why. These new monarchies emerge in France, England, and Spain. All right, so let's go through these one by one. First of all, in France, and actually let me back up a little bit. What I'd like you to do as I talk about these, think about the similarities between these countries and why do we group them all together. All right, so first of all, in France, King Charles VII is going to expand his own power by creating a new kind of tax called the taille, and this allows him to raise money without asking the nobility. So what this means is, if he needs money, he doesn't have to go ask the nobility for it, so he's pretty independent of them. His descendant, Louis XI, is going to not only expand the power of the king, but he's also going to expand France's territory through war. So you've got this new tax. That's how you're going to pay for all these wars. In England, England's actually going to emerge from this civil war called the War of the Roses when King Henry VII establishes the new Tudor dynasty. So the War of the Roses was all about this war between these 2 powerful families, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Henry VII is going to step in, he's going to get rid of them, and then he's going to create a new dynasty that's going to rule England. And much like his contemporaries in France, Henry VII is going to limit the power of the nobility. And he does this not necessarily through taxation, but creating this this court that's outside of the normal judicial system called the Court of the Star Chamber. So what he's going to do is, back in England, nobles used to be able to raise their own armies. Henry VIII is going to put an end to that, basically, by prosecuting these nobles in the Court of the Star Chamber. So dramatically increasing his power and decreasing the power of the nobility. But unlike in France, Henry VII is actually going to focus not on war, but on trade and diplomacy. And that's because war is expensive. And in England, if you need money, what you have to do is you have to go to the nobility, who make up the majority of parliament, which is the legislative body, and you're going to have to ask them for money. And Henry VIII, by not going to war and instead increasing his country's wealth through trade and diplomacy, is going to just completely avoid having to ask the nobles in parliament for money, which will increase his power and again decrease the power of the nobility. In Spain, what we're going to see, and I'll talk briefly about Spain now, we're going to spend more time on them later in this unit. We're going to see the rise of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And if those names sound familiar because you associate them with Columbus, you are absolutely on point, and we will talk about that soon. So, much like in France and England, they're going to unify their country, and they do this actually by pushing out the Muslims. So, if you remember back from middle school, Spain used to be under Muslim rule. That's on the decline by the time Ferdinand and Isabella come in, but they're going to push out the last of those Muslim rulers, bring Spain all together, establish this really strong military. But on the flip side, what they're going to do is rather than sort of persecute the nobility, as we see in France and England, they're going to persecute any remaining Muslim folks who live in Spain, as well as Jewish people. They're going to completely expel the Jews from Spain because religion, Catholicism, is going to be really, really important to sort of establishing this national identity for Spain. All right. So, in contrast to all of those states, let's talk about let's talk about a new state that we haven't really seen too much of yet, and that is the Holy Roman Empire. So, they were not one of these new monarchies because they didn't centralize or stabilize the government, and they didn't reduce the power of the nobility. So, what the Holy Roman Empire was sort of like this loose coalition of states in Central Europe, and that included the German states. So that's kind of where we're talking about, so modern day Germany. And the Holy Roman Empire was led by this dynasty called the Habsburgs. And what the Habsburgs did during this time period is, again, they didn't centralize the monarchy, they didn't sort of put an end to any civil wars or anything like that. They didn't reduce the power of the nobility, but they did expand territory a lot. And they're going to do that through dynastic marriage. So the names we got to know here are Maximilian I and then Charles V. What's kind of interesting about the Habsburgs is they used to have part of them is in Spain, part of them is in Central Europe, and Charles V is going to end up bringing those two chunks of the Habsburg family together. And let's take a look at how he does this and what his territory is. All right, check that out. Fabulous. Okay, so now that we've talked about the political context, let's talk about what the Renaissance looked like in Northern Europe. So let's talk first about Northern Renaissance humanism. So like Italian humanism, it was really focused on the study of the Greek and Latin classics. And similarly, it also emphasized education, and it also believed that knowledge can and should be used to change society. So it's very similar to those civic humanists that we saw back in Italy. But on the other hand, Northern Renaissance humanists tended to be much more religious, much more Christian than their Southern counterparts. So when they said they wanted to reform society, they really looked at, okay, well, how are we going to reform the church? They felt that the church was very corrupt. So some of the key figures from the Northern Renaissance whom we should know, so there's Erasmus, who's from the Netherlands, and he's in the picture there, and Thomas More in England. They were both really notable because they really spent a lot of their time critiquing the church and fighting back against corruption. All right, so what are the key features of Renaissance art? Well, first of all, much like the Italian Renaissance, we see an emphasis on realism and attention to detail. And something that's a little bit different in how they used realism is they depicted realistic human figures like the Italian Renaissance artists, but they didn't idealize them in the same way. So they tended to paint and depict people warts and all. They also were really focused on portraiture, landscapes, and the interiors of homes. So we'll see that in just a little bit. And unlike the Italian Renaissance, they really like to depict middle class and peasant life versus just the lives of the wealthy. So we know that a big part of the reason why the Italian Renaissance artists depicted the lives of the wealthy is because they had wealthy patrons, not always the same in the Northern Renaissance. And then we also see a bigger focus on Christian themes, and again, those Christian humanist themes. So they're a little bit more religious, whereas the Italian Renaissance was a little bit more secular. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of Northern Renaissance artwork. So this is one of my favorite Northern Renaissance artworks, and I actually have a poster of it in my classroom. It's called Giovanni Arnolfini and His Wife by Van Eyck. And Van Eyck is Flemish, so he's from Belgium. Flanders is a region in Belgium. So one thing about this picture that really demonstrates a key characteristic of the Northern Renaissance is that attention to detail. So if you check it out, there's a mirror in the background of this couple, and you can see them reflected, and you can see the artist reflected. So look at that attention to detail in that tiny, tiny mirror there. And another part of this picture that demonstrates characteristics of the Northern Renaissance is the fact that these people aren't wealthy. They're just random people. And people actually, or historians aren't really sure who exactly they are. They think they were people that Van Eyck knew. All right, so here's another example of a Northern Renaissance artwork, and you notice straight away that this isn't a painting, this is a woodcut, and that's another key feature of Northern Renaissance art. So you'll see woodcuts, in addition to oil paintings. And another feature of Northern Renaissance art we see here is that it's very religious. So this is a depiction of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Which is part of the book of Revelations, which is part of the Bible. But again, also a third feature that we see, again, is that attention to detail. All right, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching.